think I've read some headlines from the Quebec government and the Premier Legault mentioning that there is an open call for health professionals to come to support the the challenges we're experiencing in Montreal and in Quebec. So he has made an open call for that, and some of the measures that have been put in place are. I've read and studied this myself closely. They have also fast-tracked the qualification process for nurses. They've relaxed the language restrictions for healthcare workers in the province of Quebec to get more people who are primarily English speaking to come. So there are some efforts being made to increase the support from the government levels. One of the things that I want to definitely address with what you've said, Kay, is you talked about uh, mental fragility, and that's a very powerful thing to raise in conversation because I think that's one of the big areas, the elephant in the room, if you will, that's not being effectively addressed by the healthcare system. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I know that even in Toronto, for example, at Mount Sinai, uh, part of the support that Mount Sinai is providing for its staff in some areas, some departments, is they've brought in therapists or counselors to help with difficult conversations. Nurses, for example, who don't know how to say effectively, asking the question, "How do I go home and tell my child that I can't hug them because I might, potentially infect them and they can end up contracting a virus that could be fatal to them." How do you navigate those conversations effectively so it doesn't cause trauma or a negative impact on the child? So, to your point, the mental well-being aspect of the conversation definitely needs to be addressed in some way, and I think part of the
Yeah,
change
but
starts
where
with
I
these kinds
work,
of
they do
conversations.
it. Where I
Hmm.
work, they
Hmm.
do it there, but we have to call, and sometimes they start to ask for help. What you're saying is that they bring people up
Oh,
in the facility directly, so it's easier for people to go to them. But in Montreal, those programs exist, but we have to do the first step, and sometimes it's doing the first step that is harder. So
yeah.
they're like my boss was like, you can call a therapist if you want to, but sometimes it's hard to ask for help. So sometimes that's the thing, that's the most big problem.
What you just said there completely blew my mind. And the reason why, here's why, because it sounds to me like the people that are giving most help are finding it difficult to ask for the help. You see?
Always. Always.
Right? I find that fascinating.
Always it's
Um, and this first step that you're talking about, taking the first step is the most difficult. And that leads me to my next, what I'd like to ask you guys next. And maybe since, okay, we're having this conversation, I'll ask you first, and then I'll invite Jada to provide her contribution. Um, when you think about the first step and the frustration of that first step, maybe not frustration, but it's just not, it's like a roadblock, if you will. It's like I don't want to go out of my way to inconvenience somebody else, or I don't want to give somebody else my problem because I'm so used to taking care of others. Asking for help to take care of me is not something that I'm used to. Um, and that's maybe what the sentiment is or the feeling is. And I want to ask you this, okay, what are, I want you to actually think about this and give us an answer. What are your top three frustrations with the
only three.
current uh, only three for now. I'm sure we can make a longer
I
list.
can give you
Let's start
hundreds.
with three. You have hundreds. Oh my gosh. Okay. So let's start with three, and let's see how we do with tackling the first three, and then we can then add to the list after we check them off. So I know there's obviously dozens, but so that we can learn and start providing some support in our communities that support the people that have listened to this podcast. What are the top three for you?
But the first one is
Three frustrations for you.
the biggest one is the management of the schedule. Sometimes we have a lot of nurse in the evening shift, but none in the night shift. So nurses that's doing evening shift has to stay the night, and they don't have the choice. They have to stay. And sometimes there's a lot of people on the day shift, but none in the evening shift. So the most frustrating thing is the management. Even if we tell that to the bosses, they're like, "What the? she basically tell me, what the hell do you want me to do? I cannot do anything. So sometimes is that the most frustrating, because sometimes we have to do 16-hour shift, and that's hard.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, that's the biggest one.
That's the top one.
That's the
And
top
thank you for
one.
sharing that, because I think we want to talk about that in a moment. And even if we don't address it fully in this conversation, I think we have the opportunity in the future, in future podcasts and interviews, to get into a deep dive so that we can see some transformational change in some way that makes sense, because we've got to balance. I'm very mindful of the structure where we have limited resources, but we still have responsibilities that need to be satisfied. And I think everybody has the right intention around the table to lend support. I think we just need to figure out how best to reduce the frustration with the limited resources that we have. Um, and so that's your top one. What's the second one you would say? What's the second frustration you have with the current COVID-19 environment and how it's impacting your workplace?
uh there's a frustration, but there's nothing we can do. Is the stress. Everyone is stressed. We're doing a long shift. There's not enough personal. Sometimes stuff is missing, and this is not something you can really do about it. But it's how people reacting to this. You have sometimes people were like bursting in tears. Sometimes you have people busting in, like, they're screaming, they're getting angry. So it's really sometimes a toxic environment. And when I was talking about mental fragility, that's play in it. That really plays in it. So
Mm.
that's a frustration, but everyone is dealing with stress in their own way. And sometimes that way is not necessarily the most good, but nothing we can do.